So, earlier on in the week, I had prepared my sermon for today, which was going to be actually a discussion on some of the mitzvot in this week's Torah reading, and how, although they might seem outdated, but they were really very poignant for our time. That was until something was brought to my attention early this morning, which I feel should be, if you haven't heard it already, you will, but I think it should be shared. I think it's important to be shared. It's very, very poignant. Now, exactly 1 year ago today, on this Shabbat, standing right here in the pulpit on Parshat Bahar, which is this week's Torah reading, I spoke to you, or those of you that were here, about the murder of the retired French physician, Sarah Halimi, and how it shocked and horrified the Jewish world, not once, but twice. The first time, you might recall, was in 2017, when the 65-year-old mother of 3 was brutally beaten and then thrown out of the window of her Paris apartment. Now, it was unclear, as I explained to you last year, it was unclear whether she was dead before she was thrown out of the window, but she was definitely dead when she hit the ground. The Jewish world was stunned when the prosecutor in Paris said that he couldn't say for sure if it was an anti-Semitic act, despite the fact that the murderer was a Muslim immigrant from Mali who shouted, "Allahu Akbar, I killed Satan," as he committed his act. It was also shocking that her life could have been saved if the police had gone to the right address that they were given at the time, and when they did get to the right address, if they hadn't decided to wait for a SWAT team to arrive. Now, eventually, as I told you last year, the investigator in charge admitted the crime was in actual fact anti-Semitic, but in a 2019 ruling, a judge ruled that the murderer was likely not criminally responsible because his heavy cannabis use put him in a state of temporary psychosis. That was bad. That was bad. But what was really shocking and what really horrified the Jewish community at large was the second time when the French Court of Cassation, the final court of appeal in France, upheld the ruling that the killer was temporarily insane from drug use, and therefore he was not to stand trial. Now, the ruling triggered outrage in the French Jewish community. Thousands took to the streets to protest that justice was not done. And in fact, at the time, Israel's chief rabbi, David Lau, wrote a letter to the Halimi family saying that he was outraged at the decision, and he quoted passages from the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm not going to go into that now, but he went on to say, "I am convinced that he who dwells on high sees the abominable injustices and will send comfort from the heavens to the pain that you have experienced." Now, the 2 times that Sarah, and may God avenge her blood, was murdered, once was by the criminal, and the second time was by those who acquitted the murderer of the crimes. The court's ruling, however, I have to tell you, and I know that there are lawyers here, so I'm going to be careful what I say, but the court's ruling, however, was completely in line with French law. And consequently, French President Emmanuel Macron called for the law to be changed. He said and before I tell you what he said, actually, for me, that the situation was similar to what happened in America in 1982. You might remember after John Hinckley attempted to assassinate President Reagan, and he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The public felt otherwise. They felt that Hinckley was being let off. And the ruling sparked debate on the insanity defense. And since that time, 36 states in the US reformed their insanity defense laws, and 4 states actually completely abolished them. Courts did overturn the abolishment because they felt that the insanity defense was necessary. It was actually would be unconstitutional, etc., etc., etc. Now, by no means am I an expert in French law? Don't think of that for 1 second. And I'm not going to try to analyze the rulings, as I said to you last year, based on French law. But what I am a little bit of an expert on, and not much of an expert, but a little bit of an expert, is about Jewish law. And the question one has to ask is, does halakha provide for an insanity defense? And would it apply in a situation such as this one? Notwithstanding Rabbi Lau's calls for justice, the Jewish tradition clearly has an insanity defense built into halakha. In fact, the original source for the insanity defense anywhere is found in the Mishnah, dating back to the 2nd century. The Byzantine Romans learned it from the Jews, and the Anglo-Saxons learned it from the Romans. And the Mishnah, and I'll just very briefly read it to you because we do want to move on, but what the Mishnah actually says, that all are obligated on the 3 pilgrim festivals to appear in the temple to sacrifice an offering except for the deaf, the mute, an imbecile, and a minor. So the rabbis picked up and said, well, okay, what do we constitute as an imbecile? And we're told it's the one who goes out all night, and one who sleeps in a cemetery, and one who rends his garments, one who hurts himself. This is what the Mishnah brings down. One who does not have halachic status is considered an imbecile. And I'm not going to go into in greater detail than that, but nowadays, of course, we rely on the testimony of psychiatrists to determine whether someone is mentally competent or not. Now, there are many references in the Talmud that back up certainly this defense, but it's one thing to say that one has a permanent or at least a very long-lasting mental condition such as schizophrenia. They should be exempt from punishment. But there is another thing totally about temporary insanity because somebody has voluntarily got themselves high. And the Talmud addresses this question as well. And they talk about if somebody instructed a document to be prepared, a legal document, and then recants because he says he was not of sound mind at the time, the Talmud says it's too bad. We go by what your original instruction was. So temporary insanity that's caused by drugs or alcohol is the person responsible for their actions. Now, why do I bring this up today? And the reason why I bring this up today is because President Macron, he called for the following. He said that we need to change the law in France because France does not judge its citizens who are sick. We treat them. But deciding to take drugs and then going crazy should not, in my opinion, take away your criminal responsibility. And I believe that is exactly the approach that Judaism would support. The problem is, of course, Macron hasn't acted on that yet. Maybe now that he's re-elected, he will get round to it. So what is this relevant to today, and why am I bringing this up? The reason being is that in the early hours of this morning, a 90-year-old Jewish man, René Hajij, was shoved off the balcony to his death in France. French authorities claim that the murder of René Hajij was the result of a dispute between neighbors, even though his neighbor happened to be an irritated Muslim gentleman. Still waiting on confirmation, of course, of that. We don't want to cast any aspersions. We don't know all the details yet, but the breaking story is horribly similar to that of Halimi's murder back in 2017. French authorities were very quick in the early hours of this morning to dismiss anti-Semitic motivation, which is nothing strikingly new. The loved ones of René Hajij will see no justice, just like the loved ones of Sarah Halimi and many other forgotten French Jews. Cries for vengeance within Judaism don't happen. They aren't going to bring back the dead. They aren't going to bring back Sarah Halimi, and they aren't going to bring back René Hajij. But Jews in France, like in other places in Europe, do not feel safe. I still have family in England, and they tell me how they feel. It's not good. What could help is for France to change the law, and the whole of Europe should be changing their laws. Just as Macron suggested 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But furthermore, it's important for French society, as well as the whole of Europe, to realize that we have a very, very real problem of anti-Semitism in our midst. Here in Montreal, not a month ago, before our very eyes, we witnessed the beating of an older man in Westmount for refusing to give up his Israeli flag. You must have seen it. You must have seen it. It was all over the internet. The police are investigating. Government the world over need to speak less and act more. They need to act more in fighting anti-Semitism, because make no mistake, what is happening in Europe and what is happening across the US is just a precursor to what will happen here if we allow it. Shane and Mason, you today are going to be picking up the torch from your parents, from your grandparents. Whether you like it or not, one of the things about becoming a bar mitzvah is accepting responsibility and accountability. And that means you're going to have to stand up for sometimes things that are very uncomfortable. We'll speak more about that in a moment, because it means fighting for your heritage, and that includes anti-Semitism. My friends, I'm telling you, don't bury your heads in the sand. I grew up in a country where Molotov cocktails were thrown at synagogues. That was nothing new. Where kids were beaten up, Jewish kids were beaten up going to school by thugs, anti-Semitic thugs. Don't ever say that I'm only one person and I can do nothing, because you can. We all, each and every one of us, individually and collectively, have the ability to, at least, if not eradicate, certainly suppress the rise of anti-Semitism, which is today at the highest level since the Second World War. Shabbat Shalom.